You may believe you are walking toward financial freedom, but if the consciousness beneath your steps is not aligned with divine law, every effort you make will only carry you deeper into the desert of financial struggle. You can work longer hours, you can hustle harder, you can call it progress. But speed on the wrong mental path is only a swifter arrival at exhaustion and disappointment. I must confront you with a truth that will shatter the illusion you may have been carrying for years about money and prosperity. Financial abundance is not at the far end of a long, exhausting climb up the mountain of endless effort. Abundance is not something you must chase through sleepless nights, grasp for through desperate schemes, or outwork everyone else to obtain. Abundance is not a prize for the most stressed and overwhelmed laborer. Financial abundance is your divine birthright, and it is already flowing toward you like a mighty river, if you will stop swimming against the current and align yourself with the true path of spiritual prosperity that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Hear me when I say this revolutionary truth: you are not chasing money. Money is chasing you. But if your consciousness is turned the wrong way, if your thoughts are flowing in opposition to divine law, you will never meet the abundance that is seeking you out. This is the lie we expose today: that constant financial struggle, ceaseless worry about money, and relentless effort are the hallmarks of the prosperous life. They are not. They are the hallmarks of a consciousness lost on the detour of fear-based thinking, moving further from the ordained way of divine supply. The true path of financial abundance is not paved with anxiety and strain. It is illuminated by spiritual understanding. On this path, every financial need is met. Every door to opportunity is opened. Every provision is already waiting at the appointed place in your journey. I declare this now, not only for myself, but for you who are hearing my voice. I walk the true divine path, where all financial supply meets me without delay. This is not wishful thinking. This is not an experiment. This is the law of God applied to the landscape of your financial life. When you walk in alignment with spiritual principles of abundance, you cannot be led into financial lack. Your supply cannot miss you, nor can you miss it, for the law itself ensures the meeting between your need and its fulfillment. Today, we will strip away the false mental trails that lead to poverty. We will lift the fog that has made the path to prosperity appear hidden. We will set your consciousness on the road that is straight, clear, and blessed with infinite supply. And you will walk it with the absolute assurance that every step carries you not toward financial struggle, but into the full, overflowing manifestation of your abundant life. There is a law that governs the flow of money into your life, just as surely as there is a law that governs the rising and setting of the sun, the pull of the tide, the steady orbit of the planets. It is the law of consciousness alignment, and it is as unerring as the compass that points always to true north. Scripture says, "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he." Not as he hopes, not as he wishes, not as he pretends, but as he truly believes in the depths of his consciousness. This is the sacred condition of financial law: the alignment of your deepest thoughts and beliefs with the truth of infinite supply. Picture yourself with a compass in hand, standing in a vast forest of financial confusion. Around you are countless trails, some wide and appearing prosperous, others narrow and hidden. Without the compass of right consciousness, you could wander for years, even decades, circling the same ground of financial limitation, mistaking busy activity for progress toward prosperity. You might choose a path that appears promising, but ends in a thicket of debt and disappointment. You might double back on yourself without realizing it, repeating the same financial mistakes, and telling yourself that next time will be different. But when you hold the divine compass of aligned consciousness, when you walk by the law of spiritual abundance, you cannot be misled financially. It will always point you toward the treasure, the destination where your supply, your perfect income, your ideal opportunities are already prepared and waiting for your arrival. This law does not speak in financial confusion or contradiction. Its language is peace about money. Its signals are clarity about opportunities, inward assurance about provision, and the sense of rightness that comes when your consciousness is moving in harmony with infinite abundance. The world will try to tempt you with get-rich, quick shortcuts, with financial detours disguised as golden opportunities, with loud voices urging you down paths of fear and limitation. But the law of consciousness alignment is never hurried about money, never pressured about provision, never unclear about supply. It leads with precision toward financial abundance, even if the next step it shows you appears small or humble. And every small step taken in obedience to spiritual prompting about money is part of a great and perfect sequence, leading you unfailingly to the abundance that already has your name written upon it. Miss the compass of right thinking, and you will walk in circles of financial struggle. You will repeat money lessons that were meant to be mastered long ago. You will mistake financial business for blessing. But honor the compass of spiritual consciousness. Acknowledge God as your source in every financial decision, every investment, every expenditure, and you will find yourself continually in the right place at the right time, meeting the right people, receiving the right resources, and moving with a financial grace that the world will call luck, but which you will know as divine law operating through aligned consciousness. Alignment with the divine compass of abundance does not happen once in a lifetime and then remain automatic. It is a daily, hourly, moment-by-moment act of choosing to acknowledge divine supply above the noise of financial appearances, economic opinions, and personal will. Scripture makes no secret of the formula for financial success. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. This acknowledgement in financial matters is not a hurried prayer offered only when bills arrive. It is a continuous recognition that there is an intelligence, a perfect order, a loving mind that knows the path to your financial abundance better than you know your own next financial step. To align with this compass daily, you must begin each morning with the spoken word that sets your financial consciousness. Divine order governs my financial path. I cannot be led into lack. Speak it before you rise from your bed. Speak it as your feet touch the floor. Feel it not as a request for money, but as a decree about a spiritual law already in operation. This statement is not a wish for your finances to improve someday. It is the recognition that the law of abundance is already guiding your money matters, and that nothing, no economic circumstance, no financial error, no monetary misstep, can divert you from the course of prosperity prepared for you. Throughout the day, reinforce this alignment in every financial decision, great or small. When faced with a choice about spending, saving, investing, or earning, pause and speak the acknowledgement. Divine order governs my financial path. Then listen, not with anxious strain about money, but with calm expectation for the inward nudge, the subtle lift of peace, or the quiet tightening of unease that signals whether to step forward financially or step aside from an opportunity. These signals are the language of the financial compass. Ignore them, and you will feel the drag of financial resistance later. Unexpected expenses, delayed income, missed opportunities. Honor them, and you will walk with the strange ease. That is the mark of being divinely guided in money matters. Practical financial alignment also means removing the mental habits that throw the compass needle into confusion about money. Complaining about your current financial situation, speaking in fear about economic futures, insisting on your own financial plans without consulting divine wisdom. All of these are like magnets near the compass, distorting its accuracy in guiding you to abundance. Your role is not to design the financial map of your life, but to follow the path of prosperity as it is revealed step by step. And here is the paradox that so few trust. The more faithfully you follow each financial step shown to you, the faster you arrive at the abundant life you seek. There is a vast difference between financial motion and financial progress, between wandering in hopeful circles around money problems and walking with the calm certainty of one who knows their financial destination. Many live their entire lives mistaking financial activity for advancement, chasing money opportunities, not because they are divinely appointed, but because they are afraid to stand still long enough to listen for spiritual guidance about their finances. This is why the reprogramming of your mind from financial wandering to purposeful abundance walking is not optional. It is essential if you are to remain on the true path to prosperity. The financially wandering mind is a scattered consciousness, drawn by every glittering investment opportunity, seduced by the urgency of the latest financial trend, tossed like a ship without a rudder by the winds of economic conditions and market fluctuations. The financially purposeful mind moves in a straight line toward abundance, guided by the inner compass of spiritual understanding, unmoved by the false urgency of financial appearances or the panic of others about money. The first step in this financial reprogramming is to replace the inner question, "I hope I'm making the right money decisions," with the unshakable declaration, "I am guided unerringly to my financial abundance." The former statement is soaked in financial doubt. It is an admission of monetary uncertainty, a seed that will grow into hesitation and second guessing about every financial opportunity. The latter statement is rooted in divine law about abundance. It affirms that the one who directs your financial path cannot err, and therefore you cannot be misled about money matters. Each time you speak this financial decree, you draw your consciousness back from the fog of economic guesswork into the clear light of spiritual certainty about your abundance. This shift must happen not only in your words about money, but in your mental imagery about wealth. See yourself not as a weary financial traveler, scanning the economic horizon for signs of opportunity, but as a confident abundance pilgrim, moving along a sunlit road of prosperity. Every financial step aligned with the invisible grid of divine order. Imagine the road of abundance itself, subtly adjusting beneath your feet to keep you financially on course. Imagine financial detours closing before you can take them. Investment traps dissolving before you can fall into them. The way to prosperity clearing, just as you arrive at each decision point. Hold this image of financial guidance until it becomes your default picture of money and abundance in your life. For the subconscious accepts whatever is impressed upon it most consistently about finances, and once it accepts the picture of you as a guided, purposeful abundance walker, it will adjust your feelings, your financial choices, and even your money-related actions to match that image. The law of non-resistance is one of the most liberating principles you will ever learn on your journey to financial abundance. For it is the law that removes the heavy, exhausting friction from your steps toward prosperity. Scripture tells us, "Agree with thine adversary quickly," and in that brief command lies a key that will keep you from being financially diverted off the true path to abundance. To agree in this financial sense does not mean to accept poverty or to submit to economic injustice. It means to remove your inner opposition, to present financial facts, so that you can move forward with prosperity consciousness, instead of wrestling with what currently appears to be true about your money situation. Financial resistance is the stubborn, clenched posture of mind and heart that insists your money situation must change before you can proceed with abundance consciousness. Financial non-resistance is the open, flowing posture that says, "I move forward in prosperity consciousness, regardless of what appears in my bank account or financial circumstances." Picture the true path to your financial abundance as a smooth road stretching before you. Along the way, you encounter stones of unexpected expenses, branches of financial delays, perhaps even a sudden stream of economic challenges crossing the way. Financial resistance is the act of standing before the expense and cursing it, refusing to move forward in abundance consciousness until it somehow vanishes. You waste precious mental energy and indignation about your money situation, delay yourself in futile argument with financial facts, and in the meantime, the flow of supply that was meeting you just beyond the next bend is held back by your own resistance. Financial non-resistance is the act of stepping lightly around the expense with unruffled prosperity consciousness, moving through the economic challenge, or if required, gently handling the financial difficulty with no inner disturbance about money. You remain in motion toward abundance, and in doing so, you remain in alignment with divine timing for your financial breakthrough. When you resist financial circumstances, you create a fork in the road, a detour of your own making that leads into frustration and financial delay. The adversary in this law is not necessarily a person who owes you money. It may be a financial circumstance, an economic condition, or even a memory of past money troubles that provokes irritation or fear about finances. The more you push against financial circumstances with your thoughts and emotions, the more they push back. For resistance to money problems is a magnet for prolonged financial struggle. But the moment you release the inner tension about your financial situation and say, "Divine order governs my money matters too. I meet this financial challenge with peace and keep walking toward abundance," you disarm the financial adversary and dissolve its power to hinder your progress toward prosperity. To dissolve financial resistance, you must first recognize it not as a noble stand for your financial rights, nor as proof of strength about money matters, but as a subtle enemy of your own progress toward abundance. Financial resistance disguises itself well in your consciousness. It can sound like moral conviction about money. It can feel like self-protection from financial loss. It can masquerade as fighting for what is financially mine. Yet under the lens of divine law, financial resistance is simply the locking of your will against the natural flow of abundance. It is a mental wall you build with your own thoughts, blocking the very financial good you are praying for. Dissolving financial resistance does not mean abandoning wisdom about money or accepting financial injustice. It means refusing to let any outward financial condition steal your inner prosperity consciousness, or stop your forward mental motion on the path of abundance that God has set before you. The first tool I give you is the spoken command about your finances. Every financial obstacle on my path melts into perfect abundance. Say it aloud slowly, as if your words carried the very heat that dissolves the ice of financial opposition. Feel the wall of money resistance softening at your decree. You are not addressing people who owe you money, or pleading with financial circumstances to change. You are speaking directly to the pattern in consciousness that has been holding the financial obstacle in place. Divine law responds instantly to a command rooted in faith about abundance, for it recognizes spiritual authority in the voice that speaks in harmony with prosperity truth. The second step is to replace the clenched posture of reaction to financial problems with the open posture of acceptance of present money facts as the ground upon which divine order will work, not acceptance of permanent financial defeat, but acceptance of the present financial moment as the starting point from which abundance consciousness will transform everything. The instant you say about any money situation, "This too is under the government of God's abundance," you shift from resisting financial life to cooperating with prosperity law. In that cooperation with divine abundance, you free the law to rearrange financial events, reconfigure money relationships, and clear the path to prosperity without your constant interference through worry and resistance. Let me give you an example of financial non-resistance in action. A woman once came to me whose long-awaited promotion with a substantial salary increase, was suddenly blocked by office politics and budget cuts. She was furious about the financial injustice, ready to wage a mental war against those she believed were opposing her financial advancement. I told her instead to practice financial non-resistance. Each morning, she affirmed about her money situation. Every financial obstacle on my path melts into perfect abundance now. Within weeks, the very executives who had blocked her promotion were transferred to other departments, and she was offered a position with greater pay and freedom than the one she had been mentally fighting for. Her financial success came not from pushing harder against the circumstances, but from stepping into the flow where divine law could act without the obstruction of her own financial resistance. Financial resistance binds you to the money problem you are resisting. Financial non-resistance releases both the problem and you with it, opening the way for abundance to flow in ways you never could have forced or manipulated into existence. Struggle is not a sign of virtue in money matters. It is a symptom of misalignment with abundance consciousness. Many have been taught to glorify the financial grind, to wear money stress as a badge of honor, to equate endless financial striving with worthiness for prosperity. But divine law does not reward financial strain. It responds to abundance consciousness, receptivity to prosperity, and alignment with the flow of infinite supply. When you live in financial struggle consciousness, you are fighting the current of the very river of abundance that is meant to carry you. When you live in prosperity flow consciousness, you allow that current to do its work, guiding you effortlessly toward your financial abundance. Mental reprogramming from financial struggle to abundance flow is not about becoming financially passive or careless with money. It is about becoming synchronized with the movement of divine supply, so that your financial actions are supported by spiritual power, rather than driven by human will alone. The first step in this financial reprogramming is to catch the words that anchor you to the energy of money struggle. The moment you hear yourself saying about finances, "Why is making money so hard?" you must replace it with, "I move with ease toward my financial abundance." The old question invites financial frustration, keeps you focused on money difficulty, and tells your subconscious to expect more of the same financial struggle. The new statement opens the channel for financial grace, tells your mind to look for ease in money matters, and reorients your vibration toward cooperation with abundance law, rather than resistance to prosperity. Visualization will help to seal this shift from financial struggle to abundance flow. Each morning, see yourself walking on a smooth, illuminated road of prosperity. There are no sharp financial turns that take you by surprise, no hidden money pits to trap your feet, no heavy financial loads on your back weighing down your progress toward abundance. The road of prosperity rises gently under your financial steps, and the light before you reveals exactly where to go for your next abundance opportunity. This imagery of financial ease is not fantasy. It is a spiritual blueprint for abundance that your subconscious will begin to reproduce in your outer financial life. Every time you hold this picture of financial flow, you are impressing upon your mind the expectation of ease in money matters. And the mind, being obedient to expectation about finances, will guide your financial choices and perceptions to fulfill that expectation of abundance flow. You will find that as you practice this shift from struggle to flow consciousness, even financial tasks that once felt heavy will take on a sense of ease. Money opportunities will arrive without the exhausting chase. People will appear at the right time with exactly the financial resources or information you need. And perhaps most importantly, you will begin to enjoy the journey toward abundance itself. For flow consciousness turns each step toward prosperity into a joy instead of a financial trial. You will come to understand that abundance is not only the destination, but the atmosphere of ease and grace through which you travel to reach it. The law of assumption is the unseen architect of your financial reality, quietly shaping every step of your money path to match the inner financial identity you have accepted as true about yourself. Scripture declares about abundance: all things whatsoever ye shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive. Believing about money is not mere hope for financial improvement. It is assumption. The mental and emotional act of receiving abundance in consciousness before the money form appears, of walking in the inner certainty that your financial desire is already an accomplished fact in divine mind. This law operates without hesitation in money matters. It mirrors back to you in financial form whatever you have most deeply assumed about yourself and your relationship with abundance, whether that assumption is one of prosperity or of financial limitation. Think of financial assumption as slipping into the shoes of the person who has already arrived at financial abundance. You do not keep glancing down at your bank account to question whether the prosperity fits. You wear the consciousness of abundance naturally. Move in prosperity thinking without self-consciousness, and go about your financial business as if wealth has always been your natural state. The moment you assume the financial identity of one who already possesses abundance, the money path beneath you begins to rearrange itself to match that prosperous identity. People, opportunities, and financial resources are drawn into your experience, not because you chase them with desperate energy, but because you became the person to whom such abundance naturally belongs. Yet many sabotage this law by living in the contradiction between financial desire and financial identity. They say, "I want more money," but their inner language about finances is soaked with lack consciousness. Their posture around money is hesitant. Their financial decisions are made from a place of scarcity thinking. The law cannot deliver financial abundance to you if you continually deny it through your own money-related self-image. To walk the true path to prosperity, you must make the inner financial shift first. Become in money consciousness what you desire to be in financial form. This is why financial assumption must be practiced deliberately. In the morning, before you face the financial demands of the day, step into the feeling of your abundant financial self. Ask, if I already had the financial life I desire, how would I think about money, walk through my day, speak about abundance, and make financial decisions today? Then do those things not in pretense about money, but in faithful embodiment of the truth about abundance that you are aligning with. The law will take care of the outer financial details once the inner prosperity position is fixed in your consciousness. To assume the abundant financial self is to make a conscious, deliberate choice to step out of the identity of the financially struggling seeker and into the identity of the prosperous possessor. It is to lay down the weary garments of trying to make money, waiting for financial breaks, and hoping for abundance, and to clothe yourself in the regal attire of one who already lives in the manifestation of financial freedom. This is not an exercise in financial fantasy. It is the deliberate alignment of thought, word, and action with the truth of your abundant being. You are not pretending to have money you don't have. You are revealing the prosperous self that already exists in divine mind. The command you will use to anchor this financial identity is simple yet absolute. I walk today as the one who has already arrived at financial abundance. Not tomorrow when the money comes, not next week when the opportunity appears, not when the debt is paid, but today. You will speak it as you plan your financial day. You will speak it as you make money decisions. You will speak it whenever the old financially struggling self attempts to reassert itself in your consciousness. When you walk into financial situations, you will walk with the posture of one whose money needs are already met. When you speak about finances, your tone will carry the quiet confidence of one who draws from an inexhaustible source of abundance. When you plan financially, You will plan from the premise that the resources are already in place, the money way is already open, and the prosperous outcome is already assured. To strengthen this financial assumption, engage in a brief daily visualization of abundance. Close your eyes and see yourself moving through a day in your financially abundant life. Not a day of extraordinary financial events, but an ordinary day in which prosperity is simply the air you breathe financially. Notice the home you wake in, the way you carry yourself around money matters, the kinds of conversations you have about finances, the financial choices you make without hesitation or fear. Observe the ease with which you give and receive money. Let your senses be engaged, the feel of quality in the things you own, the scent of the abundant spaces you inhabit, the taste of the financial freedom you enjoy. This is not daydreaming about money. It is impressing upon your subconscious the financial reality you are choosing to embody in consciousness. As you practice this financial assumption, you may feel the old money, worried self tugging at your sleeve, whispering doubts about finances, or reminding you of bank account appearances that seem to contradict your assumption of abundance. This is where your discipline in the spoken word about money comes in. You do not debate with the old financially fearful self, you override it with prosperity truth. You say, I walk today as the one who has already arrived at financial abundance. And you keep walking in that consciousness. Each repetition is a stroke of the chisel, removing the stone of false financial identity until the figure of the abundant self stands, revealed in full prosperity consciousness. For the next 7 days, I am challenging you to live as though financial obstacles no longer exist in your vocabulary, in your thinking about money, or in your speech about abundance. This is not a test of financial endurance, it is a test of prosperity mastery. For 1 full week, you will refuse to give financial resistance the power of your words. You will speak only of the smoothness of your money path, the ease of your financial progress, the certainty of your abundant destination. If an apparent financial block arises, you will not name it a money problem. You will call it a prosperity bridge in the process of appearing, a divine detour leading you to abundance, even better than you imagined financially. This discipline is not about denying financial reality. It is about redefining money reality through the lens of abundance truth. Here is how you will keep this prosperity vow. From the moment you wake each day, declare aloud, every financial step I take is guided. Every money turn is timed. My abundance path is clear. Say it before you even rise from your bed, setting the prosperous tone for the financial hours ahead. As you move through the day, listen closely to your own speech about money. If you hear yourself start to describe something financially as hard, blocked, delayed, or stuck, stop immediately and replace it with a declaration of financial flow. This too is moving me forward financially. This too is part of my perfect abundance path. You will be amazed at how quickly your outer financial conditions respond when your words stop reinforcing money struggle and begin reinforcing smooth prosperity progress. For these 7 days, you will become a guardian at the gate of your financial mind. The image of a smooth, illuminated abundance road will be your constant companion. See yourself walking it in every financial situation, whether dealing with bills, making money decisions, or thinking about your financial future. That road is your true prosperity path, and in the reality of divine law, nothing can litter it financially. Nothing can block your abundance. Nothing can delay you upon the path to prosperity. If something appears to obstruct your financial way, see it dissolve into light, or see yourself gracefully moving around it, untouched in your abundance pace, and undisturbed in your prosperity spirit. At the end of these 7 days, you will look back and see that you have not only kept yourself in a higher state of financial consciousness, but you have also trained your mind to default to abundance flow instead of money friction. And once the mind is trained this prosperity way, the path to financial abundance becomes not only smoother, but shorter. Now we come to the moment where all that has been spoken about financial abundance, all that has been declared about prosperity, all that has been impressed upon your mind about wealth, is sealed in the sacred act of public decree about your money path. You have walked the abundance path in consciousness throughout this message. You have aligned with divine financial direction, removed money resistance, shifted from seeking to possessing wealth, and prepared to act from the certainty of prosperity arrival. Now you must set your financial word in motion, in a way that leaves no room for retreat to old money patterns, no shadow in which the financially struggling identity can hide. The sacred activation is your covenant with abundance law, a spoken and written agreement that the universe itself will honor regarding your prosperity. For it is not the agreement of human will with human effort, but of human consciousness with divine abundance law. The sacred sentence you will speak and write about your financial path is this: I now step fully onto the true path of financial abundance. Every step reveals more prosperity by divine law. You will say it aloud now, not as a hopeful plea for money, but as the final stroke of the chisel, carving your abundant financial identity into the stone of reality. You will feel the power in your own voice as you speak it about your prosperity path. How it resonates in the chest. How it steadies your breath about money matters. How it leaves no trace of financial doubt. Then you will take the second step of the abundance ritual. You will type these exact words in the comments as a public proclamation of your financial transformation. This is not a casual interaction about money. It is a spiritual contract about abundance. By writing it publicly, you are anchoring your prosperity truth in the world of form, setting your financial intention where it can be seen, remembered, and reinforced by others walking the same abundance path. Why public about your financial transformation? Because light dispels financial shadows. When you declare your abundance truth openly, the temptation to slip back into old money patterns weakens, for you have borne witness before others, and more importantly before yourself, about your prosperity commitment. It is a symbolic crossing of the financial threshold. You cannot go back to wandering money paths once you have stepped into the illuminated road of abundance and told the universe, this is who I am financially now. Write it now. I now step fully onto the true path of financial abundance. Every step reveals more prosperity by divine law. Now we gather every thread of financial truth we have spoken and weave them into a single unbreakable cord of abundance affirmation. A cord strong enough to hold you steady when financial appearances try to sway you, luminous enough to light your money way when the prosperity path seems dim, and alive enough to continue creating abundance long after these words have left my lips. These are not idle sentences about money. They are spiritual decrees about abundance. Each one a seed planted in the fertile soil of your financial consciousness, guaranteed to bring forth a prosperity harvest in its own perfect time. You will speak them slowly with full attention to their financial meaning, letting each one saturate your mind and impress itself deeply into the silent places within where your relationship with money is formed. I walk the path of financial abundance now and forever. Let this be your first and final truth about money. You are not beginning the prosperity journey someday. You are walking it now. You will not depart from abundance consciousness, for it is the very ground of your financial being. Every financial step I take is ordered by divine law. No money move is wasted. No abundance moment is meaningless about your prosperity path. Even the financial pauses are part of the rhythm, and the rhythm is perfect for your wealth manifestation. All financial resistance within me is dissolved. Feel the release as you say it about money matters. The unclenching of financial will. The loosening of every knot of money tension. See the stones and debris of the old financial path vanishing into abundance light. I possess my financial abundance now. This is not a claim about money to be fulfilled in the future. It is the recognition of prosperity that already exists in the eternal present of divine supply. I arrive at financial abundance with ease and joy. Not in money weariness, not in financial frustration, but in the atmosphere of prosperity celebration. The journey itself toward abundance is part of the wealth, and you take pleasure in every financial step. Speak these abundance affirmations 3 times through. The first time, let them settle in your conscious mind about money. The second time, feel them sinking deeper, bypassing financial doubts, imprinting themselves on the subconscious about abundance. The third time, speak them as if you are declaring them to the universe itself about your prosperity, commanding every force of divine law to arrange itself in accordance with your financial word. And when you have finished, rest in stillness for a moment. Let the echo of your abundance declarations fill the inner space, until there is no room left for financial contradiction. You have spoken your prosperity truth. You have sealed your abundance path, and you have claimed your financial inheritance. From this moment forward, you are not searching for the true path to financial abundance. You are walking it, living it, and proving it with every prosperous breath you take about money matters. And so it is. Your financial abundance is secured by divine law, now and forever. Amen.